Hey guys, tonight we're floating through the serene emptiness of space, where silence wraps around you like a blanket made of nothing at all. Imagine drifting above Earth, watching continents slowly rotate beneath you while your ears experience something they've never truly known before: absolute quiet. Fair warning though, once you've tasted this kind of peace, returning to our noise polluted world might feel like sensory assault. You probably won't survive this transition back to reality without longing for that cosmic quiet again. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where in our noisy world you're tuning in from, so drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're 3 days into your first space mission. The initial excitement of liftoff has settled, and you've adjusted to the strange choreography of microgravity. It's during a scheduled rest period that you first notice the silence, not the absence of sound exactly. The environmental systems still hum. Your crewmate across the module still turns pages in her notebook, but there's a quality to the quiet that feels different, profound. You hold your stylus midair, suddenly aware of how unnecessary your next note seems. On Earth, silence is never truly silent. There's always the distant highway, the neighbor's air conditioning unit, the refrigerator's subtle buzz. Your brain has spent decades filtering this constant sonic backdrop, but here, floating 254 miles above the Pacific Ocean, that filtering system has nothing to process. The silence feels almost solid, like you could reach out and touch it. You push gently off a handrail and drift toward the cupola, that bubble of windows offering Earth views that astronauts before you have described as life-changing. As you approach, you notice how the absence of sound seems to expand the visual experience. Earth looks more vivid, more present, as if your brain, freed from constant auditory processing, can devote more resources to your other senses. The research is surprisingly consistent on this phenomenon. Approximately 97% of space travelers report experiencing unusual states of calm during their missions. Initially, scientists attributed this primarily to the view that magnificent blue marble perspective. But deeper studies revealed something more fundamental at work. The unique quality of space's silence itself was rewiring temporary neural pathways. You adjust your sock, which has started to float slightly away from your foot, one of those small, ridiculous moments that still make you smile even weeks into the mission. The sock adjustment is mundane, yet in this profound quiet, it feels like a significant event deserving your full attention. There's a peculiar phenomenon happening in your perception. Without the constant noise pollution of Earth, your sense of presence intensifies. Each small action, the sock adjustment, the slow blink of your eyes, the slight movement of your finger against the window, registers with unusual clarity. It's as though the silence creates a high-definition version of reality. The commander passes by, giving you a nod. Neither of you speaks. You've all noticed how conversation has naturally reduced since arriving in orbit. It's not from procedure or protocol, it's almost instinctual, as if speaking aloud would somehow intrude upon this perfect acoustic environment. Studies from the International Space Station have documented this effect across multiple crews and nationalities. The average astronaut speaks approximately 63% fewer words in space than during equivalent time periods on Earth. Below, lightning flashes silently across the Indian Ocean. From this vantage point, Earth's most violent weather systems play out like silent films. You watch weather fronts collide in slow motion, creating storms that will dominate news cycles, but that appear from here as gentle, quiet swirls of white against blue. The disconnect between what you know, the howling winds, crashing thunder, and what you see, this peaceful, silent ballet, creates a surreal moment of stillness in your mind. The silence of space isn't actually complete, of course. If you could hear space directly, it would roar with radiation, magnetic fields, and the solar wind. But inside your pressurized sanctuary, protected from both vacuum and cosmic noise, you experience what might be the closest thing to true quiet that humans can safely encounter. The strangest transformation happening in your brain began about 72 hours after reaching orbit. Neuroscientists call it neural recalibration, though the astronauts who've experienced it often use more poetic terms, brain clearing, or mental defragmentation. As you float near the observation window, watching Earth's curvature with half-focused eyes, you can almost feel the rewiring happening behind your forehead. What's occurring is a measurable phenomenon. Your default mode network, that constellation of brain regions that activates when you're not focused on the outside world, begins operating differently in extended silence. On Earth, this network rarely gets to function optimally. It's constantly interrupted by sirens, notifications, conversations, and the general cacophony of civilization. Here in orbit, your DMN finally gets to work as evolution perhaps intended. You stretch out your hand and wiggle your fingers, slowly watching them move with unusual fascination. This simple action, something you've done countless times without notice, now seems worthy of complete attention. A neuroscientist would tell you that your brain's sensory processing areas are receiving fewer competing inputs, allowing for deeper focus on singular experiences. The silence up here isn't just the absence of noise. Veteran astronaut Helen Chen told researchers during her third mission. It's like finding a room in your brain you never knew existed. You're beginning to understand what she meant. There's a quality to your thoughts that feels different, clearer, less cluttered, yet paradoxically more connected to everything around you. The station passes into Earth's shadow, and daylight fades dramatically. In this transition, you experience one of those moments of surreal stillness, a pause between day and night that seems to stretch beyond normal time perception. Without the constant background noise of Earth, these transitional moments take on an almost ceremonial quality. Your brain, freed from processing the usual barrage of sounds, notices subtleties in light and feeling, in existence itself, that typically slip past your awareness. You take a sip from your water pouch, watching the liquid form a perfect sphere at the straw's end before you capture it with your mouth. Even this mundane action takes on a meditative quality in the station's profound quiet. The subtle sound of the water entering your mouth seems significant, noteworthy. Studies conducted on the ISS have documented how the brain's auditory cortex actually begins to reassign some of its processing power after extended periods in space's relative silence. MRI scans of returning astronauts show temporary but significant changes in how their brains process sensory information changes that persist for weeks after returning to Earth. It's like the brain gets a chance to clean house, explains Dr. Marissa Kohler, lead neurologist for the Orbital Psychology Program. Without the constant noise pollution we experience on Earth, neural pathways that have been overworked get to rest, while others that have been underutilized finally get some exercise. You notice your breathing has slowed considerably as you've been gazing out the window. Without thinking about it, you've fallen into a relaxed 4-7-7-8 breathing pattern that meditation practitioners on Earth strive for but rarely achieve without years of practice. Up here, it just happens naturally, another unexpected effect of the station's unique sensory environment. You smile slightly, remembering how the pre-flight psychologists warned about isolation and confinement stress. What they didn't emphasize enough was this profound sense of neural peace that comes from the unique quiet of orbital life. The silence isn't oppressive, it's liberating. Time works differently in this environment too. Without the auditory markers that typically divide your day, the morning traffic, the office chatter, the evening neighborhood sounds, your perception of time becomes more fluid. You check your watch and realize you've been floating by the window for nearly an hour, though it felt like only minutes. A crewmate silently floats into the module, makes eye contact, and smiles before continuing toward the sleeping quarters. The brief interaction requires no words, yet feels complete. You've noticed how crew communication has evolved over the weeks, becoming more efficient, more intuitive. Studies show that after just 2 weeks in orbit, crew members develop an increased sensitivity to nonverbal cues, compensating for the reduced verbal communication that naturally occurs in this environment. The brain scanning equipment in the science module has been documenting these changes in all of you. Weekly cognitive tests show improvements in certain types of processing, particularly in pattern recognition and creative problem solving, while Earth-based control subjects show no such improvements. Something about this silence is literally making you smarter, at least in specific ways. You push off gently from the window frame, floating toward your workstation. As you move through the module, you pass through subtle temperature gradients, slightly warmer air near equipment cooler near the external walls. On Earth, these minute temperature changes would go unnoticed beneath the sensory barrage. Here in the station's profound quiet, these subtle variations register clearly, creating an invisible topography of sensation that you navigate intuitively. Your heartbeat has changed since arriving in orbit. It's not just the well-documented cardiovascular effects of microgravity. The fluid shifts the slight cardiac atrophy that begins after a few weeks. There's something else happening, something the biomedical team is still trying to quantify. In the station's unique silence, your heart seems to have found a different rhythm. Cardiologists at Mission Control have noticed this pattern across multiple crews. Without Earth's constant noise, pollution, human hearts appear to settle into a more efficient beating pattern. Your resting heart rate has decreased by nearly 8 beats per minute since arrival, despite the known stressors of space travel. The leading theory suggests that without the constant startling effects of urban noise, car horns, sirens, sudden shouts, the heart finds its natural optimal cadence. You place your hand on your chest, feeling the steady thump through your flight suit. There's something almost cosmic about this rhythm now. Some researchers have even suggested controversial theories about human physiology having evolved to function optimally in environments more silent than modern Earth provides. Whether or not that's true, the data is clear. 97% of space travelers experience this cardiac calming effect. Across the module, a fellow astronaut is preparing a meal, the gentle clicking of the food preparation area, the only sound breaking the comfortable silence. You watch their methodical movements with unusual interest. On Earth, you might be checking your phone while waiting for food, but here the simple human activity, the opening of packets, the careful measuring of water, becomes almost hypnotically engaging. You hold a spoon, midair caught in a moment of distraction as Earth comes back into view through the nearby window. The spoon, perfectly balanced in microgravity, doesn't fall as it would on Earth, allowing this pause to extend as long as you need. These small moments of suspended animation occur throughout your days now, little pockets of perfect stillness that would be impossible in terrestrial gravity. There's something about the station's silence that seems to synchronize with larger cosmic rhythms. Without Earth's 24-hour sensory patterns, the morning traffic crescendo, the midday lull, the evening wind down, your body has begun responding to subtler cues. You orbit Earth every 90 minutes, experiencing 16 sunrises and sunsets daily. Rather than creating chaos in your internal clock, this oddly seems to reset it to something more fundamental. We've documented a shift in circadian rhythms that doesn't match what we expected, explains Dr. Yuri Petrov, chronomedicine specialist for the mission. Instead of getting confused by the rapid day-night cycle, astronauts' bodies seem to lock onto a more fundamental rhythm, possibly related to the galactic year or other cosmic cycles we don't fully understand yet. The research is still preliminary, but brainwave recordings show that after approximately 14 days in orbit, your neural oscillations begin to synchronize with extremely low-frequency electromagnetic fields that are masked by Earth's louder electromagnetic environment. In the relative electromagnetic silence of space, these subtle fields become the dominant rhythmic influence. A gentle alert tone, one of the few intentional sounds in your environment, reminds you of the upcoming team check-in. Even this small sound seems almost jarring after hours immersed in the station's natural quiet. You notice a slight elevation in your heart rate in response to the tone, a measurable indication of how adapted you've become to silence. Time to gather with the crew. You push off with one finger, that's all it takes in microgravity, and glide toward the conference area. As you move, you experience one of those moments of surreal stillness that have become more frequent during your mission. Despite your physical movement through the station, there's a sense of perfect calm of existence suspended between moments. Without Earth's constant background noise, these states of consciousness become accessible without the years of meditation practice they would require planetside. The commander nods as you join the small circle of floating colleagues. Words are used sparingly now, almost precisely rationed like water or oxygen. It's not from conservation protocols, but has evolved naturally among the crew. Research teams on Earth are fascinated by this consistent pattern across missions, how human communication in orbit shifts significantly toward nonverbal modes after just weeks in space. You adjust your position, slightly tucking one foot under a handrail to stay anchored. The subtle physical sensations, the slight pressure of the rail against your arch, the gentle touch of fabric against skin as your sleeve moves register with unusual clarity. Sensory neuroscientists call this tactile foregrounding, a documented phenomenon where touch sensations become more prominent in environments with reduced auditory input. As the brief meeting concludes, you realize once again how few words were actually exchanged. Efficient, yes, but also somehow more meaningful than the word-filled meetings you remembered from Earth. In the space station's profound quiet language has become more precious, more deliberately used. Studies show that crews typically reduce verbal communication by 60 to 70% while maintaining or even improving task performance and team cohesion. You push off again, this time toward the exercise module. Your daily workout session is approaching, necessary to combat muscle and bone loss, but now serving another purpose too. In the station's unique, quiet physical exercise has taken on an almost meditative quality. Without music, without distraction, the simple rhythm of movement and breath becomes a form of active stillness, another way your body is finding harmony with cosmic rhythms far from Earth's clamorous environment. Somewhere around your fourth week in orbit, you begin noticing how your thoughts have changed shape. It's not just their content, though, that has certainly shifted toward the philosophical, but their actual structure and movement through your consciousness. In the station's profound silence, thoughts seem to become almost tangible objects that you can examine from multiple angles. The psychology team had briefed you about potential cognitive effects of long-duration spaceflight. They mentioned the overview effect, temporary spatial disorientation, even the well-documented mild euphoria that affects most astronauts. But no one adequately prepared you for this, the way your backlog of unprocessed emotions and ideas would surface in this silent environment, presenting themselves for inspection one by one, like patient visitors. You're currently floating in the sleep station during designated rest time, watching how a single drop of water from your drinking pouch has escaped and is now hovering near the ventilation intake. The perfect sphere catches light from your reading lamp, creating miniature rainbows as it rotates slowly. On Earth, this moment would be unremarkable, a spill to wipe up. Here in the station's profound quiet, it becomes an object of deep fascination worthy of sustained attention. Psychologists studying space crews have documented this heightened capacity for sustained awareness. Without the constant auditory distraction of terrestrial environments, the mind naturally shifts toward states usually achieved only through dedicated meditation practices. Your default attention span has nearly doubled since arriving in orbit, a change reflected in weekly cognitive assessments that all crew members complete. It's like having thoughts in high definition, reported one astronaut from a previous mission. You now understand exactly what she meant. Each thought seems to arrive with unusual clarity, fully formed, lacking the fragmented quality that characterized your thinking on Earth. Neuroscientists attribute this to reduced processing demands on the brain's auditory regions, allowing more neural resources for other cognitive functions. You reach out and capture the water droplet with your finger, then deliberately release it again, watching it reform into a perfect sphere. This small action, you controlling an element of your environment with gentle precision, brings a satisfaction that seems disproportionate to its simplicity. The psychologists call this microflow, tiny engaging actions that create states of focused joy. In the station's silence, these microflow opportunities multiply exponentially. The station passes into Earth's shadow again, and the change in light pulls your attention to the small window in your sleeping compartment. Nightside Earth spreads below city lights, tracing human civilization across the darkness. You find yourself contemplating the irony. Those bright clusters represent not just human achievement, but also noise, constant, unrelenting noise that you can now barely imagine returning to. Since arriving in orbit, you've been keeping a journal standard protocol for psychological monitoring. Reviewing your entries shows a clear evolution in your thought patterns. Early entries focused on procedural details, physical adjustments, to microgravity observations about crew dynamics. By week 3, your writing had shifted dramatically toward philosophical reflection, existential questions, and detailed observations of your own consciousness. The silence isn't just changing how you think, it's changing what you think about. You tuck your journal away and push off gently toward the central module. As you float through the connecting tunnel, you pass through another of those strange moments of perfect stillness, a bubble in time where everything seems suspended, including your own thoughts. These moments have been increasing in frequency and duration. The neurology team is particularly interested in these experiences as they correlate with unique brainwave patterns only observed in orbit. In the central module, another crew member is carefully tending to the small garden of experimental plants. You watch silently as she uses a pipette to precisely water each specimen. Neither of you speaks, no greeting, no acknowledgement of presence seems necessary. This comfortable shared silence would have felt awkward on Earth, but now feels completely natural. Studies show that after just 3 weeks in space, crew members develop a form of silent communion that actually strengthens interpersonal bonds rather than weakening them. You notice your emotions processing differently in this environment too. A brief video call with family yesterday triggered a complex wave of homesickness that on Earth you might have suppressed or distracted yourself from. Here in the station's profound quiet, that emotion simply unfolds itself, fully presenting all its facets for examination. You don't resist it, you observe it. And in that observation, the emotion transforms from something painful into something merely informative, a data point about your human experience. The silence becomes a processing medium, explains Dr. Lakshmi Patel, lead psychologist for long-duration missions. Without constant auditory input competing for neural resources, the brain can finally address the backlog of emotional and cognitive content that most Earth dwellers carry unknowingly. Brain scans show increased activity in regions associated with emotional processing and integration after just 2 weeks in orbit activity patterns, similar to those seen in experienced meditators after years of practice. You place a hand against the cool metal wall of the station, feeling the barely perceptible vibration of life support systems. This subtle, tactile input, this whisper of mechanical function, seems almost loud in the surrounding silence. You close your eyes and focus entirely on this sensation against your palm. Time stretches as your awareness narrows to the single point of contact between yourself and the structure that keeps you alive in the vacuum. When you open your eyes again, you notice the earth has completed another quarter turn beneath you. You've been standing hand pressed against the wall for over 20 minutes, though it felt like moments. This time, dilation effect has been well documented in space psychology literature. Without the auditory markers that typically segment time on Earth, perception becomes remarkably elastic. Studies show astronauts consistently underestimate time spent in contemplative states by an average of 340%. You push off again, heading toward the exercise module for your scheduled physical activity. As you move through the station's silent modules, you realize that your thoughts, those high-definition, fully formed visitors, have arranged themselves into a pattern that feels like clarity. A problem with the water reclamation experiment that had been puzzling the team for days suddenly presents its solution to you, complete and obvious. This phenomenon has been reported by enough astronauts that NASA now schedules integration periods of silent contemplation before complex problem-solving tasks. The silent space station, it turns out, might be the most powerful thinking environment humans have ever created. There's an ancient memory awakening in your body as your mission extends into its second month. It's not something cognitive, not a thought or an idea, but something cellular, something written into the very structure of your being. In the profound darkness and silence of orbital night, when Earth eclipses the sun and even the ambient hum of the station seems to retreat, you feel it stirring. Evolutionary biologists have theorized about this, how humans evolved for hundreds of thousands of years with regular experiences of true darkness and true silence. These conditions were normal for most of human existence, with each night bringing an absence of light and sound that modern humans rarely experience. Your ancestors would have known this state intimately, this darkness, this silence, and perhaps your body remembers it in ways your conscious mind cannot. You're currently in your favorite viewing position, floating in the cupola during orbital night. The station's interior lights are dimmed for night cycle, and you've turned off your personal light to experience the full depth of space's darkness. The stars are impossibly bright, without atmospheric distortion, and in the profound quiet, you could swear you almost hear them, not with your ears, but with something older, something more primal in your nervous system. The human organism evolved specific restoration mechanisms that are triggered by conditions of darkness and silence, explains Dr. Hiroshi Yamamoto in his controversial paper on what he calls ancestral state therapy. His research suggests that modern humans are chronically deprived of these primitive restoration triggers, leading to numerous subtle dysfunctions of body and mind. Here in orbit, you've inadvertently created perfect conditions for these ancient mechanisms to activate. You rub your thumb against your fingertips, feeling the ridges of your fingerprints with unusual sensitivity. This simple action, this connection to your unique physical identity, grounds you as the vastness of space stretches in all directions. The psychologists call these embodiment practices small physical actions that help maintain psychological stability during the potentially disorienting experience of spaceflight. But in this moment, it feels more primal than psychological, a reminder that you remain human despite floating among the stars. The research is accumulating something happens to human consciousness after extended periods in the silence and darkness of space. The initial data suggested it was merely stress reduction or novelty effect, but longer missions have revealed something deeper occurring. Brain scans show patterns surprisingly similar to those documented in practitioners of ancient contemplative traditions. Monks who spend years in silent darkness, desert hermits, practitioners of certain sensory deprivation rituals that date back thousands of years. A message notification blinks softly on a nearby screen, but you don't immediately check it. This too represents a change. Before your mission, you responded to notifications with near Pavlovian immediacy, a conditioning common to most modern humans. Now, after weeks in orbit's unique sensory environment, that compulsion has faded. The silence has retaught you the art of choosing when to engage a skill your distant ancestors would have taken for granted. You watch your own breath form a tiny cloud in the cooler air near the window, then dissipate slowly. This visible evidence of your own life process, this cyclical exchange with your environment, creates another moment of surreal stillness. There's something about watching your breath in space that connects to ancient human practices. Meditation teachers speak of following the breath. In orbit's silence, the breath becomes not just a focus of attention, but a visible companion. The station passes back into daylight, and solar panels automatically reorient with a distant mechanical whisper. This transition, this returned light, triggers something profound in your nervous system. You feel a wave of what can only be described as recognition, as if your body is saying, yes, this cycle, this rhythm, this is what we were made for. Chronobiologists have documented how space travelers' circadian systems often begin showing patterns that align not with Earth's 24-hour day, but with more ancient solar-lunar rhythms that may have governed human physiology before artificial light. You notice a strand of your hair floating freely in front of your face. With deliberate slowness, you reach up and tuck it behind your ear, a normal, everyday gesture made extraordinary by the environment. This simple human action, performed while floating among the stars, creates a perfect juxtaposition of the mundane and the cosmic, the ordinary and the extraordinary. It's in these moments that many astronauts report experiencing a profound sense of what psychologists call integrated being, a state where the various aspects of self harmonize completely. Researchers studying space travelers' experiences have documented consistent reports of what they term ancestral connectivity, a sense of connection to human evolutionary history that strengthens during long-duration missions. Brain imaging shows increased activity in regions associated with self-concept and temporal awareness, as if the brain is actively recontextualizing the self within a much broader timescale than usual waking consciousness typically accesses. You push away from the window, propelling yourself back toward the central module. As you move through the silent station, you notice how your perception of your own body has shifted over the weeks. There's an awareness of your physical self that feels both heightened and different, less identified with appearance, more connected to function and sensation. Neuroscientists attribute this to changes in how the brain maps the body when freed from gravity's constant downward orientation cues. But some researchers suggest the station's silence plays an equally important role in this perceptual shift. The silence, they theorize, allows ancient neurological pathways to reactivate pathways that evolved during humanity's long history of living in much quieter environments. Without the constant auditory processing demands of modern Earth, your nervous system has gradually returned to operating modes that characterized human experience for most of our species' existence. You arrive at the science module, where another crew member is silently documenting plant growth in the experimental garden. You take your position at an adjacent workstation, beginning your own scheduled tasks. Words aren't exchanged, yet there's a palpable sense of connection, what anthropologists might recognize as the comfortable shared silence that characterized much of human interaction before the constant chatter of modern society became normalized. Studies of isolated groups consistently show that human ancestors likely used language much more sparingly than contemporary humans, reserving speech for when it was truly necessary, rather than filling silence habitually. In the station's profound quiet, you're not just visiting space, you're visiting a sensory environment much closer to what your ancient ancestors experienced nightly, and something deep in your cellular memory recognizes it as home. The release from Earth's gravitational pull has transformed more than just your physical relationship with objects. By your 7th week in orbit, you've noticed a profound shift in how you carry your psychological burdens as well. The constant metaphorical weight of terrestrial life deadlines, social tensions, financial pressures has redistributed itself in your consciousness, just as the fluids have redistributed in your body. Psychologists studying long-duration space missions have documented this phenomenon across diverse crews. Without gravity's constant downward pull, the mind seems to release its habitual patterns of anxiety projection. The physical sensation of weightlessness apparently triggers a corresponding psychological unburdening. It's not that your problems have disappeared, it's that they've lost their directional pull on your attention. You're currently performing maintenance on the water recovery system, a task that would have felt tedious on Earth. Here, as you carefully turn a valve with precisely calibrated pressure, the action absorbs your complete attention. The slight resistance against your fingers as you make the adjustment feels satisfying in a way that's difficult to articulate. These small tactile experiences have taken on remarkable significance in the station's unique sensory environment. Gravitational unloading creates neural unloading, explains Dr. Elena Kuznetsov, neuropsychologist specializing in microgravity effects. Without the constant processing demands of navigating a gravitational field, the brain reallocates significant resources to other functions. Brain scans show that after just 6 weeks in orbit activity, in regions associated with spatial navigation, decreases, while regions linked to introspection and sensory appreciation show increased blood flow and neural activation. You watch a small air bubble travel through a transparent section of tubing, a potential issue that needs addressing. On Earth, you might have felt a spike of stress about this complication in your task. Here, it registers simply as information, as an interesting development requiring resolution. This cognitive neutrality toward potential problems has developed gradually during your mission. The psychology team calls it orbital perspective shift and considers it one of the most valuable adaptations to spaceflight. I came back seeing problems differently reported astronaut Sunita Williams after her 195-day mission. On Earth, problems feel heavy, they push you down. After months in microgravity, problems just feel like puzzles floating in front of you that you can examine from all sides. This perspective shift persists in many astronauts for months after returning to Earth's gravity, suggesting a fundamental rewiring of stress response pathways rather than a temporary effect. You secure a panel that had been vibrating, slightly tightening it with a small tool. The simple action brings a disproportionate satisfaction, another example of the microflow experiences that characterize life in orbit. Without Earth's gravitational load, even small accomplishments register with unusual clarity in your reward system. Neurochemical analyses suggest that dopamine pathways function differently after extended periods in microgravity, requiring less stimulation to produce satisfaction. A fellow crew member floats past, giving you a thumbs up on your repair work. The brief social acknowledgement creates a warm glow of connection that lingers longer than similar interactions would on Earth. Studies of orbital crews consistently show that positive social exchanges have amplified emotional impacts in space environments. The researchers theorize that without gravity's constant sensory load, social interactions register more prominently in consciousness. You push off gently from the module wall, propelling yourself toward the storage area to return your tools. As you glide through the silent station, you experience another of those moments of surreal stillness, a perfect suspension between moments, between identities, between worlds. Your terrestrial self, with all its accumulated tensions, seems distant now, like a character you once played rather than who you truly are. Reaching the storage compartment, you carefully secure each tool in its designated spot. This simple organizational task, maintaining order in the inherently chaotic environment of microgravity, has become almost ritually significant. Psychologists note that amid the profound disorientation of spaceflight, small actions that create order take on outsized psychological importance, providing necessary anchoring for the self. You adjust the collar of your flight suit, which has bunched slightly around your neck, another of those mundane human moments that punctuate the cosmic extraordinariness of your situation. This juxtaposition, adjusting your clothing while floating among the stars, creates another moment of integration between the ordinary and the transcendent, a cognitive harmony that characterizes much of your experience now. The transformation in how you experience emotional tensions has been particularly striking. On Earth, interpersonal conflicts seem to settle in your body tension, in your shoulders, tightness in your chest, a heaviness that felt distinctly directional, pulling you down. Here, after weeks in microgravity, those same tensions, when they arise, and they do confinement with the same small crew, inevitably creates friction manifest differently. They feel more like passing weather systems present, but mobile, lacking the fixed quality they possessed on Earth. Gravitational metaphors dominate how humans conceptualize emotional states, notes Dr. Javier Ramirez in his research on cognitive linguistics in space environments. We talk about feeling down, being under pressure, having a heavy heart. When the constant physical experience of gravity is removed, these metaphorical frameworks begin to dissolve. Interview studies with returning astronauts show significant changes in their use of spatial and weight-based metaphors after long-duration missions. The station begins another orbital night cycle lights, dimming automatically in sequence. You make your way to your sleeping compartment, moving through the modules with the easy familiarity that comes after weeks of adaptation. The trajectory of your movement, the perfect efficiency of your pushes and glides reflects another aspect of gravity's release. Without constant compensation for weight, your body has found new patterns of movement that reflect perfect efficiency using minimal energy for maximum effect. Arriving at your sleeping area, you secure yourself loosely in the sleep restraint, not because you would float away otherwise, which you would, but because the gentle pressure of the straps provides a comforting approximation of weight. This too, researchers have studied extensively how after weeks of weightlessness, astronauts begin seeking forms of pressure and resistance to counterbalance the complete freedom of microgravity. The human system, it seems, evolved with certain constraints and seeks to recreate them even when liberated. As you settle into pre-sleep routine, you reflect on how the tensions you carried up from Earth have redistributed themselves in your consciousness. Problems that seemed immovable have become malleable. Fears that felt overwhelming have become manageable. It's not that orbit has eliminated your human concerns, it's that without gravity's constant, metaphorical reinforcement, these concerns have found a more balanced, more neutral position in your awareness. The silence of the sleeping module envelops you completely now. Tomorrow brings another day of work, research, and discovery. But tonight, floating in this perfect stillness, liberated from both literal and figurative weight, you experience what 97% of space travelers report: a peace that seems to emanate not from external circumstances, but from a profound recalibration of how consciousness itself operates in the absence of Earth's gravitational pull. Time has begun behaving strangely. You've been tracking this phenomenon since about your 5th week in orbit, and the pattern is clear. Your perception of duration has become remarkably elastic. Sometimes hours compress into what feels like minutes. Other times, a single minute of focused observation stretches into what seems like an hour of experience. Chronobiologists have documented this effect across multiple space missions. Without Earth's natural time markers, sunrise-sunset, the rhythm of urban noise, rising and falling throughout the day, the brain's internal clock begins operating by different rules. Add the station's profound silence to the equation, and time perception undergoes a fundamental transformation. You're currently conducting an experiment that requires precisely timed observations, so you've set a gentle alert to sound every 5 minutes. Each time it chimes, you feel a mild surprise sometimes because it seems to arrive too quickly, other times because you were certain much more time must have passed. According to your mission journal, this temporal disorientation began in your 4th week and has been increasing steadily since. The silence creates temporal dilation, explains Dr. Marcus Wong, temporal cognition specialist for the space psychology team. Without auditory cues constantly updating your temporal processing centers, the subjective experience of time begins to decouple from chronological time. Brain scans of astronauts show distinctive patterns in the prefrontal cortex and cerebellum regions involved in time perception after just 1 month in orbit. You record another data point and check the experiment parameters, adjusting a small dial with careful precision. The physical interaction with the equipment, this small focused task, creates another bubble of hyper present awareness. For the moments you spend making this adjustment, turning the dial, with careful attention to the feedback from your fingertips, time seems to stop completely. The psychologists call these flow states, but in orbit they seem to happen spontaneously without requiring the challenging conditions that typically trigger flow on Earth. The station passes from orbital night into daylight, again sunlight flooding through the windows, in that sudden dramatic way that only happens in space. The transition creates a moment of perfect stillness in your perception, a pause between cosmic breaths. These transitional moments between light and dark have become increasingly significant during your mission. Without Earth's atmospheric gradient of dawn and dusk, these transitions happen with remarkable suddenness, creating natural punctuation marks in your experience. You take a sip from your water pouch, watching how the liquid forms a perfect sphere at the end of the straw before you capture it with your mouth. This simple action, this daily necessity, takes on an almost ceremonial quality in microgravity's silence. Time stretches as you observe the water's surface tension, the perfect physics of its spherical shape, the way light refracts through its curve. A mundane moment expands to contain universes of observation. Research conducted across multiple space agencies has confirmed that this temporal elasticity isn't merely subjective impression, but reflects actual changes in cognitive processing. Reaction time tests show that astronauts can sometimes process information more quickly during periods they describe as expanded time, while their performance slows during periods experienced as compressed time. These fluctuations don't follow predictable patterns, but seem connected to the interaction between the station's silence and the individual's attentional state. You finish logging the experimental data and close the research module, pushing off with one finger, still delighting in how little force is required to navigate in microgravity. You propel yourself toward the communication station for your scheduled check-in with mission control. As you drift through the connecting module, time does that strange, stretching thing again. The journey feels both instantaneous and eternal, your consciousness suspended in a perfect present moment that seems to contain all possible durations simultaneously. It's like living in a perpetual now, one returning astronaut described in her psychological debriefing. Not in a mindfulness exercise way, but in a way that feels like the normal boundaries of time have dissolved. Neuroscientists attribute this partly to changes in how the default mode network operates in extended silence, but some researchers suggest more speculative explanations involving how consciousness itself might function differently when freed from Earth's sensory environment. Arriving at the communication module, you notice a small tear in the Velcro patch on your sleeve. You make a mental note to repair it later, running your finger along the damaged edge. This tiny imperfection, this small disorder in your otherwise meticulously maintained environment creates another focusing point for attention. In the station's profound quiet, these minor details often become objects of deep fascination, portals into extended present moment awareness. The check-in with mission control follows its usual protocol, but you notice how different their time feels from yours. The controllers speak with the brisk efficiency of people operating in Earth's accelerated time frame, while your responses come more slowly, more deliberately from orbit's expanded temporal field. This communication mismatch has been well documented in mission psychology literature. By their metrics, some astronauts appear to develop slightly delayed speech patterns after extended periods in orbit, though the astronauts themselves report feeling that they're speaking normally, while Earth seems rushed. After the communication session ends, you allow yourself to float freely for a few moments, suspended in the module without touching any surface. This perfect stillness, this complete surrender to zero gravity, creates one of the most profound temporal distortions. Without any muscle engagement, without any physical effort to maintain position, your sense of time becomes completely unmoored. Studies using meditation-style awareness tasks show that astronauts in this floating state consistently underestimate elapsed time by factors of 3 to 5. You eventually extend a hand to gently arrest your drift, touching a handrail with just your fingertips. The simple contact, this minimal re-engagement with your physical environment, seems to partially reset your temporal perception. The psychologists theorize that tactile feedback provides chronological anchoring, giving the brain reference points for temporal processing that are otherwise absent in the station's unique sensory environment. The day's schedule includes dinner with the crew, a rare synchronization of everyone's individual timelines. As you make your way to the galley module, you reflect on how communal meals have taken on new significance during the mission. Without Earth's shared temporal markers, these scheduled gatherings provide essential social synchronization moments when individual experiential timelines reconverge into shared time. Arriving early, you begin preparing your meal portion, carefully rehydrating a packet of space-adapted cuisine. The process requires attention to exact measurements of water and precise heating time, another of those simple tasks that creates temporal focus. As you wait for the food to rehydrate, you watch the small bubbles forming in the package, finding yourself completely absorbed in this mundane process. On Earth, you might have checked your phone during such a waiting period. Here in the station's silence, even these small phenomena become worthy of complete attention, and time stretches to accommodate this fullness of awareness. The commander joins you, nodding in greeting, as she begins her own meal preparation. Neither of you speaks. Words have become increasingly unnecessary as the mission progresses, but there's a palpable sense of shared experience that transcends verbal communication. The silence between you doesn't feel empty, but richly textured with mutual understanding. Time passes differently in this shared silence, neither compressed nor expanded, but somehow perfectly aligned between your separate consciousnesses. In the unique quiet of orbital life, you've discovered what Eastern contemplative traditions have taught for millennia, and what modern physics confirms time isn't a constant flowing river, but a surprisingly malleable dimension of experience, responsive to consciousness, in ways that Earth's noisy environment rarely allows you to perceive. The paradox becomes clearer with each passing week. You've never been more physically isolated from humanity, yet you've never felt a deeper sense of connection to your fellow crew members. This peculiar intimacy that develops in shared silence has been documented across decades of space missions, but experiencing it firsthand reveals nuances that no training module could adequately describe. Social psychologists call it proximity cohesion, but that clinical term fails to capture the almost mystical quality of connection that develops when humans share extended periods of relative silence in confined spaces. By your eighth week in orbit, verbal communication with your five crew members has decreased by approximately 70% compared to your first week. Yet measures of team cohesion and mutual understanding have steadily increased according to the weekly psychological assessments. You're currently sharing the observation module with two other astronauts. All three of you float in different orientations, each appearing upside down or sideways relative to the others, one of those uniquely orbital arrangements that still occasionally strikes you as amusing. None of you has spoken for over 40 minutes, yet there's nothing uncomfortable about this shared silence. Each of you alternates between gazing out at Earth and making notes on individual tablets. Periodically, one of you will shift positions slightly, perhaps, to get a better viewing angle, and the others will unconsciously adjust to maintain the perfect spacing that has evolved between you. Astronauts develop what we call silent communion after approximately 21 days in orbit, explains Dr. Fatima Nazir, lead researcher in space crew psychology. It's a state of group awareness that doesn't require verbal exchange, but nevertheless involves complex information sharing through micro expressions, body positioning, and shared attention patterns. High-resolution cameras throughout the station have allowed researchers to document this phenomenon in remarkable detail, tracking how crew members begin moving in subtle synchronization without verbal coordination. You glance at your colleague Hiroshi, who has just made a slight sound, not quite a word, more an acknowledgement of something interesting observed. Without speaking, you shift your position slightly to follow his line of sight. A massive weather system is developing over the South Pacific, its spiral structure perfectly formed against the blue background. Wei, the third astronaut in your silent triangle, has also adjusted her position, all three of you now oriented toward this atmospheric spectacle without a single word being exchanged. This wordless coordination would have seemed eerie or uncomfortable on Earth, where silence between people often creates social tension. Here, after weeks in the station's unique auditory environment, it feels entirely natural. Studies of long-duration cruise show that this comfort with shared silence typically emerges during the third week, progressing to active preference for nonverbal communication by week 6 or 7. You make a small notation on your tablet about the storm system's formation. Hiroshi glances at your screen, nods slightly, and adds something to his own notes. This minimal exchange, this silent validation of shared observation, creates a subtle warmth of connection. The psychology team calls these micro-acknowledgements and has documented how they replace more explicit verbal affirmation in space crews over time. Wei gently pushes a floating stylus back toward you. It had drifted toward her side of the module. The small gesture requires no thanks, no acknowledgement. These tiny courtesies have become the silent currency of crew relationships, accumulating into profound bonds that require no verbal reinforcement. Researchers have noted that conflict among space crews often decreases dramatically after this silent communion phase begins, with misunderstandings becoming increasingly rare despite reduced verbal clarification. One theory suggests that without Earth's constant background noise, humans revert to more ancient forms of social connection that preceded language forms based on shared attention mirrored movement and intuitive understanding of others' needs. EEG studies of crew members after 1 month in orbit show increased activation in mirror neuron systems and other brain regions associated with empathy and social cognition, even during periods of minimal verbal exchange. The station passes into orbital night and the module darkens considerably. Without discussing it, the three of you adjust your positions again now, forming a rough circle oriented inward rather than toward the windows. This automatic reconfiguration, this wordless adaptation to changing conditions, exemplifies the emergent group intelligence that characterizes long-duration crews. Studies show that after 6 weeks together in orbit, crew members can solve complex cooperative tasks with up to 60% less verbal communication than required by Earth-based control groups solving identical problems. You reach for your water pouch, taking a slow sip as you consider this strange new form of human connection. On Earth, relationships were largely constructed of words, conversations, explanations, questions, declarations. Here in orbit's profound quiet, you've discovered a more fundamental layer of human bonding that existed beneath the verbal layer all along, but rarely had space to emerge in Earth's noise-filled environment. Wei adjusts her position slightly, tucking one foot under a handrail to stabilize herself. Without thinking about it, you find yourself mirroring her posture a few moments later, also securing a foot for stability. This unconscious movement synchronization, this physical harmonic, has been extensively documented in space station crews. Motion capture analysis shows that after approximately 45 days together, crew members begin moving with subtle, coordinated rhythms. Their gestures and positional shifts forming complex patterns of nonverbal harmony. The commander's voice comes softly over the communication system, announcing a brief meeting in 15 minutes. The words seem almost intrusive after so much comfortable silence. All three of you acknowledge with minimal responses, a raised hand, a nod, a brief, "Copy that." The efficiency of communication has reached levels that would seem almost telepathic to outside observers. Research teams analyzing crew interactions have documented how by the second month, astronauts develop communication systems requiring as little as 30% of the verbal content used by comparable Earth-based teams to convey equivalent information. You begin gathering your notes, preparing to move to the central module for the meeting. As you collect your tablet, you notice Hiroshi has silently handed you a stylus you had forgotten. This small act of attention, noticing what you need before you ask, represents another aspect of the heightened interpersonal awareness that develops in orbit's silence. Cognitive scientists attribute this partly to reduced auditory processing demands, allowing more neural resources for social observation and prediction. Moving through the connecting tunnel toward the central hub, the three of you naturally arrange yourselves in perfect spacing without discussion or hesitation. This fluid coordination, this dance without choreography, emerges naturally among humans, sharing extended silence in confined spaces. Proxemics researchers have mapped how crew members' use of shared space evolves over a mission, finding that by week 8, they navigate common areas with near perfect efficiency, minimizing both collisions and excessive distance. Arriving at the central module, you join the rest of the crew. The commander begins the meeting, speaking with the economy of words that has become standard. Mission updates are shared briefly, questions are minimal, and much is communicated through gesture and expression. An observer from Earth would likely find the interaction strangely abbreviated, perhaps even cold, but you and your crewmates experience it as richly informative and deeply connecting. When the brief meeting concludes, there's no chatty aftermath, no lingering social exchange. The crew simply disperses to individual tasks, yet you all carry a renewed sense of cohesion from these few minutes of deliberate synchronization. Studies of space crews consistently show that these minimal verbal exchanges, when they occur against a background of comfortable, shared silence, actually strengthen group bonds rather than diminishing them. As you return to your scheduled tasks, you reflect on the paradox again. Never have you spoken so little with people, yet understood them so thoroughly. In the station's profound quiet, you've discovered that human connection has always had this deeper, wordless dimension. It was just waiting for the right conditions to reveal itself. Window gazing has become your primary meditative practice. You've logged over 120 hours at various viewing ports throughout the station, watching Earth rotate beneath you in its hypnotic blue-white spiral. The psychology team has a specific term for this activity, Earth observation behavior, and tracks it carefully across all crew members. The data shows a consistent pattern. After the initial novelty period, most astronauts settle into regular viewing sessions that average 37 minutes and occur approximately twice daily. What they can't quantify in their data is how these observation sessions have transformed your relationship with time. Earth viewing has become a form of temporal travel for you, not physically, of course, but psychologically. As you watch continents and oceans passing below your mind, naturally shifts from daily concerns to geological timescales, from personal narratives to planetary perspective. You're currently floating in your favorite observation position in the cupola, the 7-windowed dome that offers the most comprehensive Earth views. Below, the Sahara Desert spreads in shades of ochre and amber ancient lake beds, visible as slightly darker patches against the endless sand. Seeing these massive geological features from orbit naturally pulls your thoughts into deeper time, not just human history, but Earth's history measured in hundreds of millions of years. The silent Earth observation experience triggers what we call temporal decompression, explains Dr. Julian Mercer, chronopsychologist specializing in space adaptation. Without Earth's constant auditory markers of present-time traffic conversations, notifications, the mind naturally begins exploring longer timescales, both forward and backward. Interviews with returning astronauts consistently report this phenomenon, describing how Earth-gazing sessions often trigger thoughts spanning millions of years in either direction. You adjust your position slightly, tucking a foot under a handrail to maintain stability as the Mediterranean comes into view. The cradle of Western civilization appears as a brilliant, blue, irregular shape nestled between continental masses. From this distance, there's no visible evidence of the human drama that has played out along those shores for thousands of years. No cities visible, no borders, just the geological reality of land meeting sea. This visual perspective creates a corresponding psychological perspective, a natural detachment from immediate human concerns. Africa slides out of view as orbital night approaches. In the last moments before darkness, you catch the glint of sunlight on the Atlantic, a momentary flash of brilliance that creates another of those strange moments of surreal stillness in your perception. Time seems to pause, extend, and encompass both present awareness and cosmic scales simultaneously. The psychology team calls these integrated temporal experiences and considers them among the most valuable cognitive effects of spaceflight. You reach out and touch the cool glass of the window with one finger, creating a small physical connection with the barrier between yourself and the vacuum. This simple action, this grounding in immediate physical reality, provides balance to the vast temporal scales your mind has been exploring. The research shows that successful long-duration astronauts regularly alternate between these expanded states of awareness and simple present moment physical actions. Those who don't develop this rhythmic alternation often report more psychological difficulties adjusting to the unique conditions of spaceflight. The station completes its passage into Earth's shadow, and the view outside transitions to darkness, punctuated by city lights. These human constellations, tracing coastlines and river valleys, create their own form of time travel, a shift from geological to historical perspective. You watch the illuminated networks spreading across continents like luminous nervous systems, each light representing human activity, human lives, human stories, unfolding even as you observe from above. Sweet Earth observation behavior shows distinctive patterns in brainwave activity, notes Dr. Samira Patel, neuroscientist specializing in space cognition. We see increased theta wave activity associated with deep meditative states alongside gamma patterns linked to insight and perspective shifts. EEG recordings from astronauts during Earth viewing sessions consistently show these patterns emerging after approximately 4 minutes of silent observation. You adjust your position again, floating back slightly to take in a wider view. The simple movement, this small navigation through microgravity, brings you back to present moment awareness, briefly before your mind begins another temporal journey. This rhythmic alternation between immediate physical reality and expanded consciousness creates what researchers call psychological integration, a harmonious balance between different modes of awareness that many astronauts describe as the most valuable psychological outcome of their missions. Australia comes into view, its distinctive shape immediately recognizable. From orbit, the island continent appears as a reddish-brown mass against the deep blue ocean. You observe its arid interior, the result of millions of years of geological processes. This visual reminder of deep time naturally pulls your thoughts back toward evolutionary timescales, how life adapted to Earth's changing conditions over eons, how human consciousness emerged recently against this vast planetary backdrop. You hold a small notebook in one hand, occasionally jotting observations as you continue your Earth viewing. The physical act of writing the pen-making contact with paper creates another anchoring point in immediate reality. Studies of astronaut coping strategies consistently show that those who maintain some form of physical documentation during their missions report better psychological outcomes than those who rely solely on digital recording methods. There seems to be something about the tangible, analog nature of handwriting that provides grounding amid the potentially disorienting expansiveness of space perspectives. The Southern Ocean comes into view, its swirling weather patterns visible as spiral formations against the blue, You watch a massive storm system rotating clockwise, a perfect demonstration of Coriolis forces in action. This visual physics lesson creates another cognitive shift from evolutionary timescales to the immediate ongoing dynamism of planetary systems. Your mind travels between these temporal perspectives effortlessly now, a cognitive flexibility that has developed gradually throughout your mission. You notice that your breathing has slowed considerably during this observation session. Biometric data collected during Earth viewing consistently shows decreased respiratory rates, lowered heart rates, and distinctive patterns of muscle relaxation. The psychology team calls this the orbital relaxation response and considers it one of the primary mechanisms by which window gazing contributes to astronaut well being during long duration missions. The station begins transitioning back into daylight Earth's curve, showing the first brilliant edge of sunrise. This transition, this planetary dawn witnessed in accelerated time, creates another moment of temporal expansion in your awareness. In the station's profound quiet, with no auditory distractions competing for processing resources, these visual experiences register with unusual depth and significance. Neuroscientists attribute this partly to cross-modal plasticity, how the brain reallocates processing resources from understimulated senses, in this case, auditory, to other sensory modes. You push gently away from the window, having completed another session of what has become your primary contemplative practice. Earth observation has been documented as the most commonly reported meaningful activity among long-duration space travelers, with many astronauts describing it as life-changing. The silence of orbit combined with the visual perspective of seeing Earth as a single integrated system creates a cognitive environment unlike anything available on the planet's surface. As you make your way back to the main module for your next scheduled task, you carry with you the expanded temporal perspective that Earth gazing naturally induces. Problems that seemed urgent hours ago have settled into a different framework within your consciousness, not eliminated but contextualized within larger patterns of significance. This cognitive effect persists for hours after viewing sessions, conclude creating what researchers call an afterglow of perspective that influences problem-solving approaches and interpersonal interactions. The peculiar alchemy of silence and distance has transformed window gazing from simple sightseeing into a form of temporal travel that no terrestrial experience can quite replicate. And this, perhaps, more than any other factor, explains why 97% of space travelers report that profound sense of peace they've experienced, a natural restructuring of temporal perspective that puts human concerns into a cosmic context that the noise-filled ground-bound human experience rarely allows. Breathing has become a conscious art form in your daily existence. By the 10th week of your mission, the simple autonomic process that you took for granted on Earth has transformed into something deliberate, almost ceremonial in its significance. In the station's unique atmosphere, maintained at precise specifications through complex life support systems, each breath has acquired a quality of preciousness that terrestrial lungs rarely experience. Environmental engineers have created a remarkable achievement in the station's air supply. The oxygen you breathe has been recycled countless times through the environmental control systems, through the experimental plants in the small garden module, through your crewmates' lungs, and back to you again. This closed-loop respiratory community creates a visceral awareness of interconnection that Earth's seemingly infinite atmosphere doesn't typically evoke. You're currently performing a series of maintenance checks on the carbon dioxide scrubbers, the critical systems that prevent CO2 buildup in your limited atmospheric envelope. As you work, you find yourself unusually aware of your breathing pattern, noticing how it changes with different movements, different thoughts, different emotional states. This heightened respiratory awareness has developed gradually throughout your mission, becoming particularly noticeable around the 8th week. Extended periods in controlled atmospheres trigger what we call breath consciousness in approximately 93% of space travelers, explains Dr. Nikolai Petrov, pulmonary specialist for the space medicine team. Without Earth's varying atmospheric conditions, and with the constant subtle awareness of life support systems, breathing naturally transitions from autonomic background process to conscious foreground activity. Respiratory monitoring shows that astronauts' breathing patterns become more regular and deliberate after approximately 40 days in orbit, resembling patterns seen in experienced meditation practitioners. You close an access panel, securing it with careful precision. The simple task complete, you pause to take a slow, deliberate breath, filling your lungs completely, before releasing the air in a measured exhale. This brief respiratory interlude wasn't scheduled, wasn't necessary for any practical purpose, yet has become a natural punctuation mark between activities for you and most of your crewmates. The psychology team has documented these spontaneous breath pauses across multiple missions, noting their increase in frequency around the mission midpoint. The station passes into another orbital sunrise, and you watch the light change across the module interior. The cycle of darkness and brightness happens 16 times daily in your 90-minute orbit, yet each transition still registers as significant, still creates a moment of heightened awareness. You notice your breathing naturally slowing during these light transitions, another documented pattern among long-duration crews. Something about witnessing these accelerated day-night cycles seems to trigger parasympathetic responses in the human nervous system. You make your way to the exercise module for your scheduled physical activity, crucial for maintaining muscle mass and bone density in microgravity. As you set up the resistance equipment, you're already anticipating how your breathing will synchronize with the movements. This respiratory physical coordination has become increasingly intuitive during your mission. Studies show that after 2 months in orbit, astronauts develop unusually efficient breathing patterns during exercise, maximizing oxygen utilization in ways that typical Earthbound athletes achieve only after years of training. Securing yourself to the exercise platform, you begin your workout routine. The first resistance pull is accompanied by a deliberate exhale, a perfect synchronization of breath and movement that feels almost choreographed, though entirely natural. In the station's profound quiet, your breathing becomes the primary soundtrack to your activity, creating a respiratory rhythm that both measures and transcends time. The silence of space environments fundamentally changes the relationship with breath, notes Dr. Lisa Cheng, psychophysiologist specializing in extreme environments. Without Earth's constant background noise, masking respiratory sounds, breathing becomes a conscious auditory experience, as well as a physical one. Recordings from personal microphones show that astronauts begin commenting on their awareness of breathing sounds around the sixth week, with this awareness continuing to increase throughout longer missions. Midway through your exercise session, you pause to drink water and adjust the equipment settings. During this brief rest, you notice how quickly your breathing returns to a baseline calm state, another adaptation that has developed during your mission. Cardiopulmonary measurements confirm that space travelers develop enhanced parasympathetic recovery responses after approximately 50 days in orbit, their systems becoming more efficient at transitioning between arousal states without the constant gravitational load that earthbound physiology must contend with. You hold a resistance strap midair for a moment, caught in a brief contemplation of this changed relationship with your most fundamental bodily process. This pause, this suspension between moments of activity, creates another instance of that surreal stillness that has become increasingly common in your experience. Time seems to stretch as your awareness centers completely on the simple sensation of air entering and leaving your lungs. Completing your exercise routine, you secure the equipment and move toward the hygiene station to refresh yourself. As you clean up, you notice how your breathing has settled into what the meditation traditions would call a natural perfection pattern, not controlled or manipulated, yet somehow optimized in rhythm and depth. Respiratory scientists have documented this phenomenon across multiple missions, showing how extended periods in controlled atmospheres seem to reset breathing patterns toward greater efficiency. You adjust the collar of your flight suit, which has twisted slightly during exercise, another of those small, mundane human moments that punctuate cosmic existence. As you make this simple adjustment, you notice again how your breath responds a slightly deeper inhale as you focus on the task than a satisfied exhale as the collar settles correctly. This respiratory task coupling has strengthened throughout your mission, creating what researchers call breath-action integration. Making your way to the science module for your next scheduled assignment, you pass through a slight temperature gradient between sections of the station. Your breathing automatically adjusts to this environmental shift, a subtle deepening that wasn't conscious or deliberate. This respiratory sensitivity to environmental nuance represents another aspect of the heightened breath awareness that develops in space. Studies using thermal mapping show that astronauts develop increased respiratory responses to temperature variations as small as 0.3 degrees Celsius after extended periods in orbit. Arriving at the science module, you find a crewmate already at work on another experiment. You exchange nods of acknowledgement, and you notice a momentary synchronization of your breathing patterns during this brief social connection. This respiratory entrainment, this unconscious matching of breath patterns during interactions, has been extensively documented in space crews after the second month. Social psychologists attribute it to increased interpersonal awareness in the station's unique sensory environment. You begin your assigned task monitoring a series of crystal growth experiments. The work requires periods of careful observation, interspersed with detailed documentation. You notice how your breathing naturally shifts with these different cognitive modes, deeper, slower breaths during observation periods, slightly quicker, shallower breaths during documentation. This respiratory cognitive coupling appears in nearly all long-duration astronauts by the third month, creating what researchers call breath cognition harmony. During a particularly delicate adjustment to the experimental apparatus, you find yourself holding your breath, briefly a natural respiratory pause that accompanies precision tasks. As you complete the adjustment successfully, your breath releases in a satisfied exhale. This pattern respiratory suspension during moments requiring peak attention becomes more pronounced in space environments. Cognitive scientists attribute this partly to the absence of gravity's constant demand on breathing muscles, allowing for greater respiratory control during focused activities. The station begins another transition into orbital night, and you watch the lighting change across your workspace. With the exterior darkness, the module's interior lights seem to intensify, creating distinct pools of illumination around active workstations. You notice your breathing deepening slightly with the darkness, another documented pattern of human adaptation to the accelerated day-night cycle of orbit. Chronobiologists have mapped these respiratory circadian responses across multiple missions, finding that they typically emerge around the 8th week. You complete your scheduled task and secure the experimental equipment. Taking a moment before moving to your next assignment, you close your eyes briefly and take 3 intentional measured breaths, a small ritual of transition that wasn't part of your terrestrial routine but has emerged naturally during your mission. The psychology team calls these respiratory boundaries and has noted their spontaneous development among approximately 87% of long-duration space travelers. Making your way back toward the central module, you pass the small garden of experimental plants, the station's other primary oxygen producers, besides the mechanical systems. You pause briefly, watching the gentle movement of leaves in the artificial air circulation. There's something deeply satisfying about this visual connection to your respiratory partnership with these plants, they processing your exhaled carbon dioxide while providing the oxygen for your next breath. This conscious appreciation of the respiratory exchange, this direct awareness of biological interconnection, represents one of the most profound perceptual shifts reported by astronauts after extended periods in closed life support systems. In the station's unique atmospheric conditions, its carefully maintained oxygen levels, its filtered absence of pollutants, its profound silence breathing has transformed from background bodily function to conscious art form, from autonomic process to intentional practice. And in this transformation lies another key to understanding why 97% of space travelers report that distinctive sense of peace. They've rediscovered the profound satisfaction of the most fundamental human rhythm experienced with full awareness in the cosmos's perfect quiet. The technology hums have faded from your conscious awareness. When you first arrived at the station, the background sounds of life support systems, computers, circulation fans, and various pumps formed a constant mechanical soundscape that registered clearly in your perception. Now, 10 weeks into your mission, these fundamental operational sounds have receded into a kind of auditory negative space, not truly silent, yet somehow registering as a form of quiet deeper than any you experienced on Earth. Acoustic engineers call this phenomenon auditory adaptation, but that clinical term fails to capture the profound perceptual shift you've experienced. It's not simply that you've stopped noticing the station's mechanical symphony, it's that these sounds have been reclassified in your neural processing from noise to silence, creating a perceptual environment that allows more subtle vibrations to emerge into awareness. You're currently in the communications module monitoring signal data while waiting for the scheduled transmission window with mission control. The equipment around you emits various operational sounds, the soft whir of cooling fans, occasional electronic chirps from the system running diagnostics, the almost imperceptible hum of processors managing data flow. 2 months ago, these sounds registered distinctly in your awareness. Now they've merged into what your brain interprets as a form of silence, more profound than their actual acoustic properties would suggest. Extended exposure to consistent mechanical sounds triggers what we call background promotion in human auditory processing, explains Dr. Suzanne Chen, audiologist specializing in extreme environments. After approximately 30 to 40 days, the brain effectively recategorizes these constant sounds as a new baseline of silence, functionally pushing them below the threshold of conscious attention. Auditory attention tests confirm that astronauts show significantly reduced responses to the station's operational sounds after the first month, despite no decrease in their actual hearing sensitivity. A status light changes on the communication panel, and you make a small adjustment to the transmission settings. The precise clicks of the control switches seem unusually distinct against the perceived background silence, another aspect of this auditory adaptation. With the constant mechanical sounds effectively filtered to baseline discrete acoustic events, register with unusual clarity, creating what audiologists call enhanced signal discrimination in the adjusted perceptual environment. The scheduled transmission window opens, and you exchange brief technical communications with mission control. The voices coming through the speaker have that characteristic earth quality, surrounded by subtle background noises that now sound strangely busy and cluttered to your adapted perception. Studies of returning astronauts consistently show a period of auditory hypersensitivity upon Earth return, with many reporting that terrestrial environments sound chaotic and overwhelming after adapting to the station's filtered soundscape. Communication complete, you make your way toward the science module for your next scheduled task. As you move through the connecting tunnel, you encounter a pocket of different acoustic properties, a slight change in how sound reverberates in this section due to its structural configuration. 3 months ago, this subtle acoustic variation would have gone completely unnoticed. Now it registers clearly in your perception, creating what acoustic researchers call spatial auditory mapping, an enhanced awareness of how sound behaves differently throughout the station's various modules. You pause briefly floating in the connecting tunnel and close your eyes to focus entirely on your auditory environment. Beneath what your brain now processes as silence, you can perceive layers of sound that were previously masked by more dominant acoustic signals. The extremely faint vibration of the station's structure as it responds to thermal expansion in sunlight, the almost imperceptible movement of air through circulation systems, the distant subtle sounds of a crewmate working in another module. This enhanced auditory discrimination represents another aspect of neural adaptation to the station's unique sensory environment. What astronauts experience isn't actually silence in the acoustic sense, notes Dr. Viktor Nazarov, specialist in psychoacoustics. It's a fundamental recalibration of the auditory attention system that effectively creates a new perceptual baseline. This allows for awareness of sounds that fall below normal terrestrial thresholds of perception. Audio spectrum analysis confirms that the station actually contains constant sound across multiple frequency ranges, yet experienced astronauts consistently describe it as quieter than anything on Earth. Continuing to the science module, you begin preparing for a series of experimental observations. The equipment preparation creates various sounds, plastic components touching as you assemble the apparatus, the click of latches securing the soft beep of systems initializing. These discrete acoustic events stand out with unusual clarity against your adapted baseline, creating what researchers call enhanced auditory figure ground contrast in your perception. A slight metallic ping from somewhere in the station's structure draws your attention momentarily, the sound of metal responding to temperature change as you orbit into sunlight. 3 months ago, this sound would have been completely lost in the general mechanical background. Now it registers, not just as noticeable, but as informative your adapted perception, immediately classifying it as a normal thermal expansion sound rather than a potential concern. This acoustic discernment represents a sophisticated level of auditory processing that develops during long-duration missions. You secure the final component of the experimental apparatus, the slight click of connection registering with perfect clarity in the perceived silence. This enhanced auditory precision has practical benefits for space operations. Astronauts with adapted hearing can often detect subtle changes in equipment function before diagnostic systems register problems, identifying the specific location and nature of potential issues based purely on slight variations in operational sounds. As you begin the experimental procedure, you notice the gentle sound of your own breathing, the inhale and exhale that would be completely masked in Earth's noisier environments, now clearly audible in your perception. This awareness of self-generated sounds represents another aspect of auditory adaptation in space. Studies using in-ear microphones show that astronauts become increasingly aware of their own physiological sounds, breathing, swallowing, even the blood pulsing through vessels near the ear as their auditory systems adapt to the station's controlled acoustic environment. The experiment requires precise timing, so you've set a gentle alert to sound at specific intervals. When it chimes softly, the sound seems almost dramatically prominent against your adapted baseline of silence. This perceptual contrast, this enhanced signal-to-noise ratio in your auditory processing creates what researchers call acoustic efficiency, allowing for effective communication and alerts with much lower actual sound levels than would be required in terrestrial environments. You complete the experimental sequence and begin documenting results on a tablet. The soft tapping of your fingers against the screen creates another layer of discrete sound against the perceived silence. You've noticed how crew members have naturally decreased the volume of self-generated sounds over the course of the mission, typing more softly, moving with less acoustic impact, even modulating breathing to lower amplitude. This unconscious acoustic consideration emerges in all long-duration crews, creating what social acousticians call sonic courtesy in shared environments. A crewmate enters the module, and you exchange nods of acknowledgement. The sound of their movement, the subtle rustling of clothing, the soft contact of hands against handrails for navigation registers with unusual clarity in your adapted perception. Studies of crew interactions show that after 3 months in orbit, astronauts can often identify specific individuals purely by the acoustic signatures of their movements, a level of auditory discrimination that terrestrial humans rarely develop. As you finish your documentation and secure the experiment for its runtime, you take a moment to float freely in the module, closing your eyes again to focus on this unique perceptual environment. Beneath what your brain now processes as silence, you can perceive what might be called the cosmic background, the extremely subtle vibrations that reach the station from the surrounding space environment conducted through its structure. These aren't sounds in the conventional sense, but rather vibrations at the very threshold of perceptibility that become accessible only after extensive auditory adaptation. In this profound perceptual quiet, this space beyond Earth's constant acoustic bombardment, something ancient in human awareness has awakened. And perhaps this more than any other factor explains that peaceful state reported by 97% of space travelers. They've rediscovered how to hear the universe's subtlest vibrations, accessible only in the absence of terrestrial noise. Dreams have taken on extraordinary dimensions in orbital slumber. By the 12th week of your mission, sleep has transformed from mere biological necessity into a nightly journey through expanded states of consciousness that bear little resemblance to terrestrial dreaming. The sleep researchers monitoring your mission have a clinical term for this phenomenon: microgravity-induced dream enhancement. But even their scientific terminology struggles to capture the profound alterations you've experienced in your dream life. The pattern began subtly around your 3rd week in orbit. First, dream recall increased dramatically from remembering fragments of perhaps 1 or 2 dreams weekly on Earth to vivid recollection of 3 or 4 complete dream narratives nightly. By week 6, the dreams themselves had begun changing in structure and content. Now approaching the mission's final month, your sleep consciousness has evolved into something the pre-flight psychological briefings never adequately prepared you for. You're currently securing yourself in your sleep station for the scheduled rest period. The gentle restraints that keep you from floating freely during sleep create a cocoon-like environment that many astronauts report contributes to the altered dream states. As you adjust the small personal items, you keep velcroed nearby a photo of family, a small notebook for recording dreams. Upon waking, you find yourself experiencing a pleasant anticipation for the night's mental journey that stands in stark contrast to your terrestrial relationship with sleep. Sleep architecture undergoes significant reorganization in microgravity environments, explains Dr. Maya Indira, neurologist specializing in space-related sleep adaptations. After approximately 30 days in orbit, EEG readings show increased time spent in theta wave states between wakefulness and sleep, alongside unusual hybrid states that share characteristics of both REM and deep slow-wave sleep. These hybrid states, almost never recorded in Earthbound sleepers, appear to correlate with the vivid yet peaceful dream experiences reported by long-duration astronauts. You secure the privacy screen of your sleep compartment and adjust the gentle airflow to your preference. These small rituals of sleep preparation have acquired an almost ceremonial quality during your mission. Studies of astronaut sleep habits show that after the initial adjustment period, space travelers typically develop elaborate pre sleep routines that bear striking resemblance to traditional contemplative practices. Systematic relaxation, mental clearing, conscious disengagement from daily concerns. These spontaneously developed routines appear to facilitate entry into the enhanced dream states characteristic of long duration missions. Settling into comfortable weightlessness, you close your eyes and notice the now familiar transition beginning almost immediately. Unlike on Earth, where falling asleep often involved a gradual dimming of consciousness through increasingly fragmented thoughts, your orbital sleep onset has evolved into a smooth, conscious transition, a gentle dissolving of the boundary between waking and dreaming states. Sleep researchers call this lucid sleep onset and have documented its emergence in approximately 71% of astronauts after 2 months in orbit. The station passes into orbital night just as you're entering the first dream cycle, the external darkness synchronizing perfectly with your internal journey. This alignment of external and internal conditions, this harmony between environment and consciousness, creates optimal conditions for what sleep scientists call immersive dream experiences. Studies correlating exterior light conditions with sleep EEG patterns show that dreams initiating during orbital night consistently show higher coherence and narrative continuity than those beginning during lighted periods. Your first dream unfolds with remarkable clarity and presence. Unlike the sometimes chaotic or fragmented quality of Earth dreams, this narrative has a coherent structure, yet remains unbound by terrestrial physics. You find yourself exploring impossible architectures that reconfigure according to your dream attention spaces that could only exist in microgravity, yet feel intuitively navigable. The dream researcher documenting your reports has noted this consistent theme: how orbital dreamers naturally create mental environments that transcend Earth's physical constraints while maintaining internal logic and emotional coherence. Within the dream, you pause to examine a small object floating before you, perhaps a crystal or mechanical component, its nature shifting as you observe it. This capacity for sustained attention within the dream state represents another characteristic adaptation of orbital sleep consciousness. Unlike terrestrial dreams that often dissolve under focused awareness, your space dreams have developed a robust stability that allows for extended examination and interaction with dream elements. The dream transitions to another scenario without the disorientation such shifts often created in Earth dreams. You're now in a vast open space where communication with others occurs without words, a direct exchange of understanding that transcends language. This theme, communication beyond verbal constraints, appears in approximately 83% of reported astronaut dreams after the second month in orbit. Sleep psychologists theorize that as verbal communication naturally decreases among awake crew members, the sleeping brain processes this shift by exploring alternative communication modes in dream consciousness. A gentle alert tone from the station's systems partially penetrates your sleep, signaling an orbital sunrise. Rather than waking fully, your consciousness incorporates this external stimulus into the dream narrative, the communication space filling with soft light that changes the interaction dynamics. This adaptive incorporation, this seamless integration of external stimuli into dream content without disrupting sleep, represents another aspect of the specialized sleep consciousness that develops in orbit. Sleep lab studies show that after 60 days in microgravity, astronauts develop an unusual capacity to process environmental information during sleep without waking, maintaining sleep continuity despite variable conditions. As the dream continues, you notice your emotional experience has a different quality than in terrestrial dreams. Where Earth dreams often contained anxiety, elements being unprepared, pursued, or embarrassed, your space dreams have evolved toward what psychologists call expansive emotional states. These experiences feature complex emotions that combine wonder, acceptance, and heightened awareness without the fear-based responses that frequently characterized Earth sleep. EEG patterns during these states show unusual synchronization between brain regions typically active during positive emotional experiences and those associated with creative problem solving. The dream shifts again, and you find yourself observing Earth from an impossible distance, seeing the entire planet rotating slowly, its atmospheric patterns forming and dissolving in accelerated time. This cosmic perspective, this viewpoint impossible in physical reality, yet emotionally significant, appears in some form in nearly all astronauts' dream reports after extended periods in orbit. The sleep research team has termed these transcendent observational dreams and notes their correlation with reported psychological well-being among crew members. In this dreamscape, you notice a small personal object from Earth, perhaps a coffee cup or familiar book, floating incongruously against the planetary backdrop. You reach for it with dream hands, the simple action creating a moment of integration between cosmic vastness and human familiarity. This juxtaposition of scales, this bridging between the personal and the universal, characterizes many astronaut dreams and appears to serve an important psychological function in processing the extraordinary context of spaceflight. The dream begins transitioning toward wakefulness, but unlike the often abrupt or disorienting awakenings of Earth sleep, this transition occurs with gradual awareness and integration. Sleep researchers call this conscious sleep exit and have documented its development in long-duration astronauts alongside lucid sleep onset, creating what they describe as bounded sleep consciousness, sleep experiences that maintain a thread of awareness from waking to waking. Opening your eyes to the dim light of your sleep compartment, you feel unusually refreshed, despite having been in a dream state for most of the sleep period. This rejuvenating quality of orbital sleep, this sense of having experienced something beneficial rather than merely having been unconscious, represents one of the most consistent reports from space station crews. Cognitive performance testing shows that after adapting to microgravity sleep conditions, astronauts typically demonstrate enhanced problem-solving capabilities following dream-intensive sleep compared to baseline measurements. You reach for the small notebook secured nearby and make brief notes about the night's dream experiences, a practice encouraged by the sleep research team, but one you would continue regardless, given the value these expanded states have come to hold. Dream documentation analysis shows that astronauts' records typically evolve from simple narrative descriptions in early mission phases to increasingly nuanced accounts of emotional and cognitive elements as the mission progresses, reflecting a growing appreciation for the complexity of orbital dream consciousness. Completing your notes, you secure the notebook and begin your wake up procedure. As you prepare for another day of orbital work, you carry with you subtle influences from the night's dream, experiences, perspective shifts, emotional insights, creative approaches to pending tasks. This integration, this permeable boundary between dream consciousness and waking function, represents what may be the most valuable aspect of adapted sleep in space environments. The sleep scientists monitoring the mission have documented how crew performance metrics often show improvement following nights of reported dream intensity, suggesting that these altered states serve not merely psychological but practical functions in the extreme environment of spaceflight. The dreams aren't simply reflections of the day's experiences, but appear to be specialized processing modalities uniquely suited to the challenges of living beyond Earth's familiar parameters. In the station's profound quiet, liberated from gravity's constant pull, human sleep consciousness has revealed capacities that remain largely dormant in terrestrial environments. And in these expanded dream states lies another key to understanding that peaceful condition reported by 97% of space travelers. They've discovered that sleep isn't merely rest, but a journey into aspects of consciousness that Earth's conditions rarely allow to emerge. The overview effect has rewritten the architecture of your consciousness. This profound cognitive shift, first named by space philosopher Frank White in 1987, describes the perspective transformation that occurs when viewing Earth as a whole system suspended in space. After 13 weeks in orbit, this isn't an occasional insight for you, but has become your baseline perception, fundamentally altering how you process information about yourself, humanity, and our place in the cosmos. The effect began subtly, with occasional moments of perspective shift during Earth observation sessions. By the third week, you notice these insights lingering after viewing periods, influencing your thinking in subtle ways. Now approaching the mission's final weeks, the cognitive transformation has integrated completely. You no longer shift between terrestrial and orbital perspective. Your consciousness operates from this expanded viewpoint continuously. You're currently conducting a series of educational demonstrations that will be transmitted to schools worldwide. As you explain orbital mechanics using floating objects to illustrate principles, you realize how thoroughly your thinking has been transformed. Concepts that once seemed abstract, Earth's systems operating as a single, integrated organism, human conflicts as temporary patterns in a larger evolutionary process, now form the foundation of your natural thinking rather than requiring deliberate philosophical consideration. The overview effect triggers neural reorganization in regions associated with self-concept and social identity, explains Dr. Hannah Reyes, neuroscientist specializing in cognitive adaptation during spaceflight. After approximately 60 days of regular Earth observation, brain scans show persistent changes in how the default mode network processes information related to group boundaries, temporal scales, and conceptual categorization. These neural changes correlate with the reported dissolution of perceptual borders that long-duration astronauts consistently describe. You complete the demonstration and secure the equipment before moving toward the communication module for your scheduled Earth transmission. As you navigate through the station's modules, you notice how this cognitive shift influences even your most basic interactions with the environment. The simple act of securing equipment isn't merely following protocol, but registers as participating in the maintenance of this human outpost in space, a small contribution to our species' gradual expansion beyond its planetary origin. The psychological literature describes this as nested systems thinking, the capacity to simultaneously hold awareness of immediate actions, their place within mission objectives, the mission's role in space exploration, and humanity's evolution as a spacefaring species. This expanded contextual awareness, rare in terrestrial consciousness, becomes the standard cognitive mode for approximately 89% of astronauts after extended periods in orbit. Arriving at the communication module, you position yourself for the video transmission. Through the nearby window, Earth passes into view the blue-white planet now so familiar, yet still capable of triggering moments of extraordinary awareness. You notice how seeing Earth from this perspective no longer requires conscious processing to appreciate its significance. The understanding of planetary wholeness has become your default perceptual mode rather than an intellectual insight requiring effort to maintain. The transmission begins connecting you with a classroom of students thousands of miles below. Their questions reflect terrestrial thinking bounded by national identities, regional concerns, and the seemingly solid divisions between human groups that geography reinforces. Your responses come naturally from your transformed perspective, gently introducing the students to a viewpoint beyond these artificial separations without explicitly challenging their framework. The psychology team calls this perspective bridging and considers it one of the most valuable capabilities that returning astronauts bring to Earthbound discourse. A student asks about borders visible from space, and you explain with gentle humor that human boundaries exist primarily in our minds. From orbit, the continuous systems of atmosphere, oceans, weather patterns, and ecosystems present themselves with far greater visual prominence than any political divisions. This isn't a practiced response, but your authentic perception now, a natural expression of how your cognitive structure processes planetary information after months of the overview perspective. The cognitive restructuring isn't merely philosophical, but appears in practical problem-solving approaches, notes Dr. Serena Mittal, cognitive psychologist studying astronaut decision-making. After integration of the overview effect, astronauts consistently demonstrate enhanced systems, thinking longer time horizons in planning scenarios, and significantly reduced in-group biases compared to both their pre-flight measures and Earthbound control subjects. These cognitive changes persist for months or even years after return to Earth, suggesting fundamental rather than temporary adaptations. The communication session concludes, and you secure the equipment before taking a moment to gaze through the viewing window again. Australia rode into view, its distinctive shape immediately recognizable. But unlike your early weeks in orbit, you no longer see it primarily as a nation or political entity. You perceive it simultaneously as a biogeographical region, a component of Earth's crustal system, a pattern of human habitation adapting to specific environmental conditions, an evolutionary story unfolding across deep time. This layered perception, this natural integration of multiple knowledge frameworks, characterizes the mature overview effect. Cognitive testing shows that after 3 months in orbit, astronauts demonstrate unusual capacity for transdisciplinary thinking, effortlessly integrating concepts across domains that specialized Earthbound experts often struggle to connect. The orbital perspective seems to dissolve not just geopolitical boundaries, but the artificial divisions between fields of knowledge that terrestrial education systems typically reinforce. You make your way toward the exercise module for your scheduled physical activity. As you move through the station, you adjust a cable that has drifted slightly out of position, a small housekeeping action that would seem mundane, but that your transformed consciousness registers within multiple simultaneous contexts, maintaining immediate orderliness, ensuring crew safety, participating in the collective project of human space presence, contributing to species adaptation beyond Earth. This expanded contextual awareness, this heightened perception of how small actions connect to larger patterns, represents another characteristic cognitive adaptation documented in long-duration astronauts. Decision-making studies show that after overview effect integration, space travelers demonstrate enhanced consideration of long-term and wide-scale impacts of choices, naturally extending their analysis beyond immediate outcomes to consider systemic effects. Arriving at the exercise module, you secure yourself to the resistance equipment and begin your workout routine. Even this necessary physical maintenance registers differently in your transformed perspective, not merely as individual health preservation, but as participation in the ongoing experiment of human physiology, adapting beyond its evolutionary context. The overview effect influences not just how you perceive external reality, but how you understand your own bodily existence. As you complete your exercise session, you notice Earth has rotated to show the Mediterranean region, cradle of Western civilization, yet appearing from orbit as simply another section of the planetary boundary between land and sea. The artificial divisions between cultures, religions, and historical narratives that seem so solid from the ground have dissolved in your perception into a single human story unfolding across one shared planetary home. This integration, this natural perception of human unity within planetary context, represents the most frequently reported aspect of the mature overview effect. You secure the exercise equipment and make your way back toward the central module. Passing another crew member, you exchange brief acknowledgments, a nod, a smile that carry layers of shared understanding impossible to articulate verbally. This nonverbal communication reflects another aspect of the transformed consciousness that develops in orbit, a recognition that certain understandings transcend linguistic expression, particularly those related to the overview perspective that you now share. The cognitive shift has subtle but profound implications for how you process even basic information. Mission scheduling, technical procedures, scientific data, all these formerly separate categories, now register within an integrated perceptual framework that automatically contextualizes each element within larger systems. This natural systems thinking, emerging without deliberate effort, represents what cognitive scientists consider the most valuable adaptation resulting from extended space habitation. In the station's perfect orbital vantage point, with Earth's wholeness continuously reinforced by direct perception, your consciousness has undergone a restructuring that terrestrial environments rarely facilitate. And perhaps here lies the deepest explanation for that profound peace reported by 97% of space travelers. They've experienced a cognitive integration that resolves the artificial boundaries and divisions that generate so much of Earth's psychological turbulence. Not everyone finds peace among the stars. While the vast majority of space travelers report profound positive transformations, approximately 3% experience something quite different, a persistent discomfort that the psychological support team delicately terms existential dissonance. As your mission enters its 14th week, you've begun noticing subtle signs of this rare response in one of your crewmates, triggering your own reflections on why some minds resist the calm that orbit typically induces. The contrast became apparent during yesterday's Earth observation session. While you floated in the customary state of tranquil awareness that the cupola views typically evoke, you noticed Elena's uncharacteristic tenseness, her jaw slightly clenched, her note-taking more aggressive than necessary, her gaze shifting away from Earth more frequently than toward it. The psychology team has documented these behavioral markers in the small percentage of astronauts who experience increasing rather than decreasing anxiety as missions progress. You're currently working alongside Elena in the science module calibrating instruments for tomorrow's experimental sequence. The slight tremor in her hands doesn't affect her precision. She's too well trained for that, but it represents another indicator of the mounting internal pressure that space psychology researchers have mapped in detail. The profound silence and cosmic perspective that creates piece-of-fuel integration for most human consciousness can occasionally trigger its opposite, a cascading existential uncertainty that builds rather than resolves over time. While the majority experience the well-documented pattern of initial adjustment followed by deep integration, a small subset demonstrates what we call existential amplification, explains Dr. Thomas Nordgren, lead researcher in space adaptation psychology. For these individuals, the very conditions that trigger expanded awareness in others, Earth observation, microgravity, cosmic silence, instead intensify pre-existing existential concerns that might have remained manageable in terrestrial environments. Brain scans of these astronauts show heightened activity in regions associated with threat assessment and existential processing, creating what researchers describe as a philosophical stress response. Elena secures a calibrated instrument and reaches for the next her movements, efficient, but lacking the fluid grace that most astronauts develop after months in microgravity. You hand her the required tool without her needing to ask one of those small courtesies that characterize crew interactions. She nods thanks without making eye contact, another subtle indicator of the inward focus that typifies this rare response pattern. The research suggests this reaction isn't a simple failure of adaptation, but rather an alternative pattern of integration. These individuals aren't experiencing the environment differently, so much as processing it through a distinct cognitive framework. Where most astronauts naturally resolve the vastness of space and cosmic perspective into a sense of meaningful connection, this minority encounters the same stimuli, but derives fundamentally different meaning, finding existential questions amplified rather than answered. Some minds encounter the orbital perspective and experience not resolution, but heightened awareness of what philosopher Thomas Nagel called the absurd, the contrast between human meaning making and cosmic scale, notes Dr. Sophia Mendelssohn, philosophical psychologist specializing in extreme environments. For approximately 3% of space travelers, the very silence and perspective that creates integration for others instead illuminates fundamental questions about purpose and significance that terrestrial environments, with their constant distractions and humanized scale, typically help mask. You adjust a research monitor, watching your own reflection briefly in its darkened screen. Your adapted consciousness has integrated the extraordinary circumstances of orbital life finding meaning and connection within the cosmic context. Yet watching Elena, you're reminded that human minds process these extreme environments through existing psychological structures, and some arrive with frameworks less compatible with the perspective shifts that spaceflight inevitably triggers. The station passes into orbital night lab lighting, automatically intensifying to compensate. Elena's shoulders tense slightly at the transition, another documented response pattern among the small percentage who experience increasing discomfort as missions progress. These individuals often show heightened sensitivity to the accelerated day-night cycle, their circadian systems struggling to maintain stability amid the 16 daily sunrises and sunsets that most astronauts eventually adapt to as a new normal. The return anxiety typically manifests around the mission's two-thirds point, Dr. Nordgren's research explains. As the Earth return approaches, those experiencing existential dissonance begin anticipating the difficulty of reintegrating their transformed awareness into terrestrial social contexts. Unlike the majority who develop effective cognitive frameworks for bridging between orbital and Earth perspectives, this minority faces the prospect of returning without having resolved the fundamental questions that spaceflight has amplified. Elena completes her calibration sequence with perfect technical accuracy despite her evident discomfort. This professional performance, despite internal struggle, represents another characteristic of this response pattern. These individuals typically maintain impeccable operational standards while experiencing mounting philosophical distress. The psychological support team monitors these crew members especially carefully, not because they present operational risks, but because they face unique challenges in processing the profound cognitive shifts that extended spaceflight inevitably triggers. You move to the next workstation, maintaining proximity without intrusion, another of those subtle crew awareness patterns that develops over months of shared confinement. The research suggests that the presence of well-adapted crew members actually helps stabilize those experiencing dissonance, providing living examples of successful integration without requiring direct discussion of the philosophical questions involved. The phenomenon doesn't represent psychological weakness, but rather a particular cognitive orientation, emphasizes Dr. Leila Havashi, cognitive diversity specialist for the space psychology team. These individuals aren't failing to adapt, but are processing the experience through frameworks that emphasize questions rather than answers, uncertainty rather than resolution. In many cases, their existential struggling eventually produces unique insights that contribute significantly to our understanding of human consciousness in space environments just through a more challenging pathway. The lab work complete, you and Elena secure the equipment and prepare to move to separate modules for your next scheduled tasks. As you're about to part ways, she pauses briefly, making rare, direct eye contact, and says simply, "It's too quiet sometimes." The statement requires no elaboration between experienced astronauts. It's a known reference to the profound silence that most find peaceful, but that some experience as an amplifier of internal questions normally masked by terrestrial noise. These astronauts often report that Earth's constant sonic environment serves a previously unrecognized psychological function, providing external stimulation that directs attention outward rather than inward, notes Dr. Victor Ramos, sensory processing specialist. Without this external auditory anchoring, certain cognitive types find themselves confronting existential questions with an immediacy and clarity that can become uncomfortable, particularly when sustained over months, rather than the brief periods such questions typically receive in terrestrial contexts. You respond with a simple nod of acknowledgement, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, just recognizing her experience as valid. This neutral validation represents the recommended crew response to expressions of existential discomfort, acknowledging the individual's experience without attempting to resolve questions that may not have immediate answers. The research shows that such small moments of recognition help stabilize those experiencing dissonance without imposing the majority's adaptation pattern as the only valid response. Moving toward your next assignment, you reflect on how space environments reveal the diversity of human consciousness, how the same conditions that trigger profound peace in most minds occasionally illuminate unresolved questions in others. The psychology team emphasizes that neither response is inherently superior. They represent different pathways through the extraordinary cognitive territory that spaceflight inevitably opens. As preparations for the return journey begin accelerating, the support team has increased scheduled check-ins with all crew members, with particular attention to those showing signs of existential dissonance. The research shows that anticipating the transition back to Earth's sensory environment can either alleviate or intensify this response pattern, depending on whether the individual perceives return as resolution or as confrontation with the difficulty of integrating their space-transformed awareness into terrestrial contexts. The 3% who struggle with the silence and perspective of space often report a different kind of transformation upon return, not the peaceful integration that characterizes the majority experience, but a heightened awareness of existential questions that remains with them long after landing. Many eventually describe their challenging experience as ultimately valuable, providing insights that more comfortable adaptation patterns might not have revealed. Their struggle represents not failure, but an alternative pathway through the profound cognitive territories that human spaceflight inevitably explores. In the station's perfect silence, with Earth constantly available as both home and cosmic object, human consciousness reveals its remarkable diversity, some minds finding resolution and peace in the same conditions that lead others to deeper questioning. And perhaps this diversity itself represents an essential aspect of our species' adaptation to environments beyond our evolutionary context. Different minds processing the same unprecedented experience through varied cognitive frameworks, collectively mapping territories of awareness that no single perspective could fully explore. Bringing space's silence back to Earth has become your mission within the mission. As your orbital journey enters its final week, you've become increasingly focused on how to preserve aspects of this transformed consciousness after return. The reintegration training has emphasized physiological readaptation, how your body will respond to gravity's renewed pull, but your personal preparation focuses on something more subtle: how to maintain the profound cognitive clarity that orbital silence has cultivated. You're not alone in this concern. The psychological record of returning astronauts shows a consistent pattern after initial excitement at homecoming. Many report a sense of loss as Earth's constant noise gradually erodes the expanded awareness that spaceflight fostered. By your third month in orbit, you and most of your crewmates have begun developing personal strategies for preserving elements of your space-adapted consciousness within terrestrial environments. You're currently in your private quarters, making final entries in the mission journal that has documented your cognitive journey. Beyond the official psychological assessments, this personal record has traced your transformation from terrestrial to orbital perspective. Reviewing the entries, you can clearly track the evolution, initial disorientation, gradual adaptation, and eventually the profound integration that the silence of space uniquely facilitates. The question now filling your thoughts: how much of this transformed awareness can survive Earth's sensory bombardment? Returning astronauts consistently report that terrestrial noise represents their greatest challenge to maintaining space-adapted consciousness, explains Dr. Maya Santos, psychologist specializing in post-mission integration. After months in environments where auditory input is minimal and controllable, Earth's constant sonic bombardment, traffic conversations, advertisements, notifications creates what many describe as a consciousness compression effect, gradually narrowing the expanded awareness that developed in orbit. You secure your journal and move toward the cupola for one of your final Earth observation sessions. These quiet contemplations of your home planet have become essential rituals, and you've been increasing their frequency as return approaches, not just savoring the experience, but deliberately strengthening neural patterns you hope to preserve after landing. The research suggests this intentional reinforcement can help maintain aspects of orbital consciousness despite terrestrial conditions. The view today features the Pacific Ocean, its vast blue expanse, punctuated by cloud systems and island chains. After months of orbital perspective, you no longer see political divisions or even continental boundaries. You perceive Earth as a single integrated system, water, land, and atmosphere, functioning as one planetary organism. This perceptual integration represents one of the most valuable adaptations you hope to preserve after return. Astronauts who successfully maintain elements of their transformed awareness typically develop specific practices during their final mission weeks. Notes Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka, Cognitive Preservation Specialist. These include heightened documentation of space-adapted states, deliberate reinforcement of desired perceptual patterns, and the creation of personalized cognitive anchors, specific sensory experiences that can later trigger aspects of orbital consciousness within terrestrial environments. You've been developing your own anchoring techniques over recent weeks. One involves a distinctive pattern of conscious breathing that you've associated with cupola observation sessions. Another utilizes a small polished stone earth material taken to space and now embedded with months of orbital handling during your most expanded awareness states. The research suggests these deliberate associations can create potent triggers for partially reactivating space adapted consciousness after return. The station begins another transition into orbital daylight sunlight, gradually illuminating the planet below. You watch the Terminator line, that dividing boundary between Earth's night and day sides, move across the Pacific. This visual experience of planetary rhythm has become deeply integrated into your perception. Unlike the anxiety some crew members feel about losing this perspective, you've developed a quiet confidence in your ability to maintain at least portions of this awareness through deliberate practice. The most successful long-term integration typically involves creating protected environmental spaces after return, Dr. Santos's research suggests. Many astronauts design specific areas in their homes that minimize sensory input, approximating aspects of the station's perceptual environment. These spaces function as transitional zones where space-adapted consciousness can be temporarily reactivated and reinforced despite terrestrial conditions. You've already begun planning such a space in your home, a room specifically designed to minimize auditory input while maximizing the cognitive conditions that facilitate expanded awareness. The design incorporates elements from both space architecture and meditation traditions, creating an environment that bridges between orbital and terrestrial experience. The research indicates that astronauts who implement such spaces report significantly better preservation of their transformed consciousness compared to those who rely solely on memory or occasional practice. The commander's voice comes over the communication system, announcing the daily briefing in 15 minutes. You acknowledge with the minimal response that has become standard among the crew efficiency of communication, representing another adaptation you hope to maintain. Unlike some returning astronauts who report feeling pressured to resume Earth's often redundant verbal patterns, you've decided to preserve this communicative precision regardless of terrestrial expectations. The social aspects of reintegration present distinct challenges, notes Dr. Elena Kuznetsov, social psychologist specializing in astronaut readaptation. Returning space travelers must navigate between their transformed perspective and prevailing social norms that reflect terrestrial consciousness. Those who manage this transition most successfully typically find balance adapting outward behavior to social contexts while maintaining their expanded awareness as an internal framework. You make your way toward the central module for the briefing, passing through the station's various sections with the effortless navigation developed over months. As you move, you consciously register the quality of silence surrounding you, not merely appreciating it aesthetically, but deliberately encoding the perceptual experience for future recall. This intentional sensory documentation represents another preservation strategy recommended by the reintegration team. Joining your crewmates for the briefing, you notice the easy nonverbal coordination that has developed among you all, how you naturally position yourselves in optimal formation without discussion, how information flows efficiently with minimal verbal exchange. This crew harmony represents another aspect of space adaptation that many astronauts report missing most acutely after return to Earth's more verbally dependent social environments. The briefing focuses on return procedures, the final experiments to complete equipment, shutdown sequences, personal item packing protocols. But beneath this operational content runs a deeper current that all experienced astronauts recognize the beginning of the transition between space consciousness and Earth readaptation. The psychology team calls this phase cognitive bridging, the gradual process of preparing adapted consciousness for return to terrestrial conditions. After the briefing concludes, you return briefly to your quarters to retrieve a small recording device before heading to the science module for your scheduled tasks. This increased documentation of final mission days represents another preservation strategy, capturing not just visual memories, but detailed verbal descriptions of your perceptual states, creating resources that can later help reactivate aspects of your orbital consciousness after return. Astronauts often report that the first few weeks after landing present the greatest opportunity for preserving transformed awareness, explains Dr. Tanaka. During this period, space-adapted neural patterns remain relatively active and can be deliberately reinforced through specific practices. Those who implement structured preservation protocols during this critical window typically maintain significantly more of their expanded perspective compared to those who passively allow terrestrial patterns to reassert dominance. Your personal preservation protocol has been developing throughout the mission's final month. It combines elements from various traditions, meditation practices, sensory isolation techniques, specific movement patterns developed in orbit, all designed to maintain activation of the neural networks associated with your expanded awareness. The research indicates that such hybrid approaches personalized to individual cognitive styles show the greatest effectiveness for long-term preservation. Working through your laboratory tasks, you notice how your attention has evolved during the mission, how you can maintain focused awareness on immediate activities while simultaneously holding expanded contextual perspective. This cognitive integration, this harmony between detailed focus and systemic awareness, represents perhaps the most valuable adaptation you hope to preserve after return. Unlike some astronauts who report feeling torn between these modes of consciousness, you've developed a unified awareness that encompasses both. The station moves into another orbital sunset, external light gradually dimming as Earth eclipses the sun. You pause briefly in your work, allowing your perception to fully register this transition, another moment of deliberate sensory encoding. The post-mission interviews show that these small pauses for full sensory awareness during final mission days correlate with enhanced preservation of space-adapted consciousness after return. As you complete your scheduled tasks and secure the equipment, a peculiar awareness grows stronger that these ordinary actions represent your final performances of them in this extraordinary environment. Rather than triggering sadness, this recognition intensifies your appreciation, creating what psychologists call temporal boundary enhancement, a heightened presence that often characterizes significant transitions. This state itself becomes another element worth preserving, this capacity for full presence amid change rather than resistance to inevitable transition. In the station's perfect quiet, surrounded by the consciousness transforming conditions of microgravity and cosmic perspective, you've discovered aspects of human awareness that terrestrial environments rarely reveal. The challenge now isn't clinging to this experience after it naturally concludes, but rather finding ways to create bridges between worlds, to bring elements of space's profound silence back to an Earth that desperately needs its clarifying peace. The 97% who find tranquility in orbit aren't experiencing something alien to human consciousness, but rather discovering what lies beneath the constant noise of terrestrial existence, an expanded awareness that remains potentially accessible even after return through deliberate practice and environmental design. Your mission within the mission has become clear, not just exploring space, but bringing its most valuable gift, its consciousness transforming silence, back to the waiting world below. As your final week in orbit unfolds, you find yourself increasingly at peace with the transition ahead, not because you expect to fully maintain your transformed awareness, but because you've discovered it exists as potential within human consciousness, regardless of environment. The profound silence of space hasn't created something new in you, but rather revealed what was always possible, a clarity of perception and integration of awareness, a peaceful presence that once discovered can never be completely forgotten, even amid Earth's noisiest moments. So you float here one last time, watching your home planet spin below, knowing that while you must soon return to its gravitational embrace and sonic complexity, you carry within you something precious, the memory of silence so profound it transformed your consciousness, the knowledge that beneath all terrestrial noise lies a potential for awareness as vast as the cosmos itself. Your breathing slows naturally into the rhythm you've associated with your most expanded states. You reach for the small stone that will travel back with you, feeling its smooth surface against your fingertips. You close your eyes, briefly encoding this moment in multiple sensory dimensions. And in this perfect orbital silence, you make a quiet promise, not just to remember this transformed awareness, but to create conditions where it can continue flourishing, however modestly, within the waiting world below. This silence has been your greatest teacher, revealing potentials within human consciousness that Earth's constant noise often masks. Now your mission becomes carrying this teaching back, bringing space's profound quiet to a planet that, despite its endless sounds, is finally ready to hear what silence has to say.